I had always dreamed of escaping the noise and chaos of the city. The concrete, the traffic, the constant buzz of people, none of it felt like home anymore. So when I found the old farm outside town, I knew this was my chance. Overgrown fields, a creaky barn, and a little farmhouse with chipped paint and sagging shutters. It wasn't much on paper, but to me, it was paradise. I imagined mornings with fresh coffee on the porch, chickens clucking in the yard, and evenings watching the sun set behind the rolling hills. Finally, peace. Finally, freedom. The first day I set foot on the property, I felt like I was stepping into a different world. The air smelled like earth and pine, untouched by asphalt or concrete. I wandered through the tall grass, imagining where I would plant vegetables, how I'd fix the fence, and where I'd build a small garden. My excitement was so palpable that I barely noticed the old goat staring at me from a neighboring property, as if judging my every move. I laughed and waved at it. I had no idea that the real judgment was waiting for me in my mailbox. A few days later, while I was hauling buckets of water to the barn, the mail arrived. Among the bills and flyers, there was an envelope with a crisp, official-looking letterhead. It read, Homeowners Association Notice of Violation and Assessment of Fees. I paused mid-step, gripping the bucket. I didn't even belong to an HOA. My farm was outside town limits, far beyond the neat streets and trimmed lawns of their jurisdiction. My heart started to race. I opened the letter, hoping it was just a mistake. Instead, it listed fees that I supposedly owed, fines for property violations I had never committed, and worst of all, a warning that failure to comply could result in eviction. My first reaction was disbelief. Could an HOA even do that to someone outside their boundaries? I read it twice, then a third time, just to be sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. Each word made less sense than the last. Then, as if on cue, another envelope arrived the next morning. This one was more aggressive in tone, stamped with urgent red letters. They repeated their demands, shortened the deadline, and even hinted at legal action if I didn't respond immediately. My peaceful little farm, which had felt like a sanctuary, suddenly felt like a battlefield. I looked at my chickens pecking lazily in the dirt and thought, are you guys going to have to testify on my behalf? I tried to brush it off with humor at first. I called the HOA's main line, half expecting someone to apologize and admit a clerical error. Instead, I got a receptionist who insisted that according to their records, I lived in their district. It says here your property is part of our jurisdiction, she repeated over and over, as if repetition could make it true. When I protested, she handed me off to the HOA president herself, a woman known in local circles for being intimidating, meticulous, and terrifyingly persuasive. Our conversation over the phone was brief but nerve-wracking. Her tone was calm but sharp, like a knife sliding across glass. She insisted I either pay the fees or face eviction. I tried to explain that the property was outside their area, but she waved my argument away with phrases like loopholes and enforceable agreements. I felt a chill creep down my spine. Somehow, the farm that had been my dream was suddenly a trap, and the gates were locked not by fences, but by bureaucracy. I hung up, staring at the fields that had once seemed so welcoming. I had a sinking feeling that this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding. Somehow, I had to fight back. I had to figure out how to protect my land, my animals, and my freedom. The dream I had worked so hard to achieve now felt fragile, hanging by a thread. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew this fight was only just beginning. I thought maybe the first letter was a fluke. Maybe someone had sent it by mistake. But when the second envelope arrived, thick and menacing, I realized there was no mistake. The Homeowners Association, this faceless organization, had decided my little farm was a target, and they weren't taking no for an answer. The letter didn't just repeat the fees, they doubled down. Fines I'd never heard of, violations I couldn't have possibly committed, and a warning that legal action could be taken if I didn't comply immediately. The language was cold, formal, and designed to intimidate. Eviction proceedings could commence without further notice. Those words stuck in my mind like nails. Eviction. From land I had just bought, land I had dreamed of for years. I couldn't just sit there. I picked up the phone and dialed the HOA's main office, trying to keep my voice calm. The receptionist answered, chirpy and unbothered, as if I were calling to order a pizza instead of contesting threats to my home. "It says here your property is part of our district," she repeated, almost smugly. "If you'd like to dispute this, you can schedule a meeting with our president." I scheduled the meeting. Deep down, I knew it wasn't going to be pleasant. When you're up against bureaucracy, meetings are never about solving problems. They're about wearing you down until you either pay or run. The day of the call with the HOA president arrived. I tried to prepare myself, scribbling notes, printing maps, and reviewing property records. When she picked up, her voice was smooth, confident, like a lawyer rehearsed in intimidation. "Good afternoon," she said. "I understand you've received our notices. How do you plan to proceed?" I explained carefully that my property lay outside their jurisdiction. I tried to stay polite but firm. I even cited the county property maps and the legal boundaries. I thought it might work, but she had an answer for everything. Every loophole I cited, she brushed aside with phrases like, "enforceable agreements and your cooperation is expected." She didn't raise her voice, she didn't have to. The calmness in her tone made her threats feel heavier, more dangerous. By the end of the call, I was drained. My hands shook slightly as I set the phone down. I glanced outside at the fields, the barn, my chickens and goats. They were safe for now, but I felt a wave of fear and frustration. The farm I had fought so hard to buy, the place that was supposed to be my escape, suddenly felt like a cage. The next day, I walked the property, trying to clear my mind. The sun was warm, the soil smelled rich, and the animals were oblivious to my stress. A goat bleated loudly, running past me, and I couldn't help but laugh. Maybe humor was all I had left. Maybe it would help me survive the coming storm. I also realized I couldn't fight this with anger alone. I needed facts, evidence, and a plan. The HOA president had shown she wasn't bluffing. She had resources, connections, and a team ready to pressure anyone who got in her way. I had me, and maybe a lawyer if I could find one willing to challenge a powerful HOA. That night, I stayed up late, scanning property maps, reading county laws, and learning more about the HOA than I ever wanted to know. Every answer I found gave me a small spark of hope, but also more questions. How could they claim fees from people outside their district? Could they really threaten eviction for land they had no authority over? And what if they tried anyway? I went to bed exhausted, haunted by the thought that tomorrow might bring another letter, another threat, or even a knock on the door. My sanctuary felt fragile. My dream of peace and independence was suddenly on the line, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew I couldn't back down. Not now, not ever. The farm had been my dream, my escape, my freedom. But the HOA had turned it into a battlefield. And I was about to learn that battles aren't won with fear, they're won with patience, determination, and a willingness to fight for what's right. After the phone call with the HOA president, I knew I couldn't rely on hope or luck. This wasn't going to resolve itself. If anything, ignoring it would only make things worse. I had to dig in, learn everything I could, and find a way to protect my farm. The fight was mine, and I had to be ready. I started with property records. Late at night, I sat at my kitchen table with a laptop, a stack of papers, and a half-empty mug of coffee. The glow from the screen highlighted the exhaustion on my face, but I didn't care. I scanned county maps, property deeds, zoning regulations, and local ordinances. I double-checked every detail, every parcel of land, every boundary line. Slowly, a pattern started to emerge. The HOA's letters referenced properties that didn't even exist. Some of the violations were for things like landscaping standards that applied only to their internal neighborhood rules, not outside property like mine. Every citation they had sent me was either irrelevant or outright wrong. I felt a mix of disbelief and vindication. I wasn't crazy. They were overreaching. But knowing they were wrong wasn't enough. I needed evidence. I printed copies of maps, highlighted boundaries, and made notes in the margins. I documented everything, the dates of letters, the fees they claimed, and the inconsistencies in their claims. I even took photos of my property, showing that it didn't match any of the descriptions in the HOA's letters. My little farm, messy, overgrown, chaotic as it was, looked nothing like the meticulously trimmed lawns in their claims. Humor helped keep me sane. I found myself imagining the HOA president's reaction if she actually visited. She'd probably faint at the sight of weeds taller than her knees, chickens running wild, and a goat chewing on a fence post. I laughed quietly to myself, sipping coffee that had long since gone cold. Maybe it was silly, but in that moment, humor felt like armor. I also started researching similar cases online. Hours passed as I read stories of people fighting overreach by HOAs, some winning, some losing. It was a mix of terrifying horror stories and inspiring victories. I bookmarked everything that might help me. The more I read, the more I realized that knowledge was my weapon. If I played this right, I could turn the tables. As the night wore on, I drafted letters in my head, outlining my defense, citing property laws, and pointing out the errors in their claims. I felt a flicker of confidence. Maybe I could fight this and win. But the more I prepared, the more I realized the stakes. This wasn't just about fees or fines, it was about protecting my home, my sanctuary, and my freedom. Then came the unease. Even with all the evidence, I knew the HOA wouldn't back down easily. They were organized, persistent, and used to people bowing under their pressure. I could almost feel their gaze on my little farm, waiting for a mistake, a misstep. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Still, I refused to be intimidated. I decided I needed allies, people who had faced similar battles or at least knew the HOA's reputation. Maybe a lawyer, maybe neighbors outside the HOA's influence. I didn't know yet, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to let fear dictate my life. By the end of the night, I leaned back in my chair, exhausted but resolute. The farm outside town, with all its weeds, creaky fences, and wild animals, wasn't just property, it was freedom. And no overreaching organization was going to take that away without a fight. I closed the laptop, turned off the light, and listened to the quiet hum of the night. Somewhere in the distance, the goat bleated, the wind rustled through the trees, and the barn settled with a creak. Everything felt peaceful for now. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The next step would take courage, strategy, and a willingness to stand my ground. The HOA might think they were in control, but they hadn't met me yet. And when the fight started in earnest, I planned to make sure they regretted ever setting their sights on my little farm. After nights of research, printing maps, and organizing my evidence, I realized there was no more hiding from the problem. The letters weren't going to stop. The threats weren't going away. I had to confront the HOA directly. I walked into their office on a sunny Thursday morning, clutching my folders like armor. The receptionist greeted me with that same overly cheerful tone, pretending nothing was wrong. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" she chirped. I forced a tight smile and said, "I'm here to meet the president regarding a dispute over property fees." A few minutes later, she called her from an office down the hall. And then I met her, the HOA president. She was exactly as I had imagined, impeccably dressed, hair perfectly styled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. There was a cold, controlled energy about her, the kind that makes you second-guess your confidence the moment you enter the room. She gestured to a chair across from her desk. I sat down, my folders spread out in front of me. "I understand you've received our notices," she began smoothly. "How do you plan to resolve this situation?" I took a deep breath. "Actually, there's no situation," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "My property is outside your HOA jurisdiction. These fines and fees don't apply to me." Her smile tightened, but she didn't lose her composure. "Our records show otherwise," she said. "We have agreements, covenants, and bylaws that apply to all properties in the surrounding area. Compliance is expected." I opened my folder, flipping through highlighted maps, property deeds, and copies of their letters. "I've reviewed your claims," I said. "As you can see here, my property is not part of your district. These addresses are incorrect, and these violations reference rules that do not apply to land outside your HOA boundaries." For a moment, she didn't respond. Then she leaned back, steepling her fingers. "Interesting," she said, her voice calm but sharp. "You clearly came prepared, But know this, our organization is thorough. We don't make mistakes lightly, and we certainly don't take kindly to disputes. I could feel my heart rate spike. The tension in the room was palpable, almost suffocating. This wasn't just a conversation, it was a test, and I refused to let fear control me. I continued, citing local property laws, county records, and previous cases where HOAs had overstepped their jurisdiction. I spoke slowly, clearly, making sure every point was backed by evidence. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't interrupt. I realized that sometimes, confidence and preparation are stronger weapons than anger or intimidation. Halfway through the meeting, a small, unexpected distraction broke the tension. The receptionist's phone rang, playing an absurd ringtone of a goat bleating. My lips twitched with a suppressed laugh. Even in the middle of this tense showdown, humor found a way in. The president's composure flickered for a split second before returning to stone-cold professionalism. By the end of the meeting, I felt a cautious sense of accomplishment. I had laid out every fact, every map, every legal reference. I had defended my land with logic and evidence. She had no immediate comeback. She finally leaned back in her chair and said, "Very well, we will review your claims, but don't expect leniency if discrepancies remain." I left the office, clutching my folders tightly, adrenaline still pumping. Outside, the sun shone, birds chirped, and my goat, I like to think he was cheering me on, nibbled on some grass nearby. I had survived my first confrontation, but I knew this wasn't over. The president's warning echoed in my mind. "This isn't over, you'll see." That night, I returned to the farm, walking through the tall grass, checking on the chickens, and listening to the soft creaks of the barn. My heart still pounded from the meeting, but a spark of determination had been lit. I realized I had two choices: back down, hand over money I didn't owe, and let fear win, or keep fighting, no matter how difficult it got. I chose to fight. Because this farm wasn't just dirt, wood, and fences. It was my dream, my escape, and my freedom. And no overly aggressive HOA president was going to take it from me without a real battle. After that tense meeting, I realized something important. I wasn't the only one being harassed by this HOA. Somewhere in their polished offices, they had convinced themselves that fear and intimidation worked on everyone. But I had proof now: knowledge, maps, deeds, and a spark of determination. Still, even with all that, taking on a well-organized HOA alone was risky. I needed backup. I started by talking to neighbors who lived just outside the HOA's claimed jurisdiction. I knocked on doors, introducing myself and cautiously asking if they'd ever received letters or fines from the HOA. At first, I met polite confusion, but then one by one, the stories started to come out. A retired couple down the road had been pressured to pay community maintenance fees for a fence they didn't even share. Another family had been warned about violations on their landscaping, even though their property wasn't even part of the HOA. The more I listened, the more I realized the scale of the problem. This wasn't an isolated mistake, it was systematic overreach. And suddenly, what had started as a personal battle turned into a shared cause. I wasn't just defending my farm, I was defending the rights of everyone outside the HOA who had been bullied, threatened, or intimidated. We started meeting in my barn late at night. It was a little chaotic. My chickens squawked and my goat kept trying to sneak into the discussion, but it felt empowering. We drafted petitions, property records, and brainstormed strategies. Some of my new allies suggested legal action. Others proposed a simple, yet bold, public statement to let the HOA know their intimidation tactics weren't going to work. Humor became our secret weapon. At one point, we made matching t-shirts that read, "Hands off our land," with a little chicken logo underneath. The absurdity made us laugh through the tension, and laughter, I realized, was as essential as any legal brief. Even with the humor, though, the stakes were high. Every step we took needed to be calculated. The HOA president had made it clear that she wouldn't back down easily. Her letters, her tone, and her actions were all part of a calculated intimidation strategy. She wanted us to feel powerless. But the more we organized, the stronger we felt. For the first time, I realized we weren't just reacting, we were planning a counterattack. Our first coordinated action was simple but symbolic, a community letter signed by all affected property owners, detailing the inaccuracies in the HOA's claims and demanding a formal review. I drafted it carefully, citing maps, legal boundaries, and county property laws. We delivered it in person and via certified mail. The receptionist's cheerful smile faded when we walked in as a group, each of us carrying stacks of documentation. I think she realized this fight was no longer just mine. But the suspense wasn't over. A few days later, an ominous email arrived from the HOA. It wasn't threatening this time, it was a summons. They demanded that we attend an emergency meeting, promising that failure to appear could result in severe consequences. My stomach dropped. Even with allies by my side, walking back into that office, facing the president again, would be intense. I spent the next nights preparing, reviewing every document, rehearsing what we'd say, and anticipating every possible tactic the HOA might use. The barn, once a place of solitude and peace, had transformed into a war room. Maps were pinned to the walls, property records stacked on tables, and my chicken coop even became a makeshift filing system for notes. The absurdity of it all almost made me laugh out loud, but there was no time for laughter yet. And then, the night before the meeting, I stepped outside, looking over the farm. The sun was dipping behind the hills, casting long shadows across the fields. The goats wandered lazily, the chickens pecked at the dirt, and the wind whispered through the trees. For a moment, the world felt calm, almost peaceful. But deep down, I knew the next day would be anything but calm. The HOA had called our bluff, and we had to be ready. The farm wasn't just my dream anymore, it was a symbol. A symbol of freedom, of standing up to authority, and of refusing to let intimidation dictate your life. And tomorrow, we would face the HOA together. The day of the HOA meeting felt like stepping into a battlefield I hadn't fully trained for, but one I was determined to survive. My barn, which had become our planning headquarters, was quiet that morning. My neighbors and I arrived early, carrying our documents, petitions, and nerves thick enough to cut with a knife. The tension was palpable, but so was our resolve. Walking into the HOA office again, I felt the familiar chill of intimidation. The receptionist greeted us with that same cheery, unflappable smile, but this time it felt brittle, forced. As we passed her desk, I noticed a stack of papers labeled compliance reports, likely full of errors we were about to expose. I took a deep breath, adjusted the stack of folders in my arms, and reminded myself why we were here. Not to argue, not to beg, but to stand our ground. Then we met her, the president. She was waiting at the conference table, perfectly poised, her hands folded, a small smile on her face that didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning," she said smoothly. "I see you've all brought your materials." Her gaze flicked over the group, sharp and assessing, like a hawk scanning for weakness. I stepped forward, laying our documentation on the table. Maps, deeds, petitions, photographs, all the evidence we had meticulously gathered. I felt the weight of each page, but also the strength that came from preparation. My neighbors nodded quietly, each of them tense but resolute. We weren't just individuals anymore, we were a team. The president began with her usual calm authority, citing rules, agreements, and obligations. Her tone was smooth, deliberate, designed to make anyone listening feel small and powerless. But this time, we were ready. I spoke first, pointing out the inaccuracies in her letters, the properties, and the violations that didn't apply. I referenced county maps, legal documents, and previous cases where HOAs had been challenged successfully. She interjected, her voice steady but sharp. "These documents may show technicalities, but the spirit of compliance still applies. We expect cooperation." I met her gaze steadily. The spirit doesn't matter if the law doesn't support your claim. Our properties are outside your jurisdiction. These fines and threats are invalid. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every word felt like a chess move, every glance like a test of courage. The president paused, scanning our files, clearly calculating her next move. Then, in a bizarre twist of absurdity, the receptionist's phone rang loudly with a ringtone of a goat bleating. For a split second, the tension cracked. I barely suppressed a laugh. Even the president's jaw twitched, a tiny crack in her composed facade before she regained her professional demeanor. As the meeting continued, back-and-forth arguments unfolded, each side trying to assert control. But we had something she didn't: facts, unity, and preparation. Slowly, the room began to shift. I could see her frustration mounting as she realized that this group of outsiders, armed with maps, laws, and determination, wasn't going to be intimidated. Finally, after what felt like hours compressed into minutes, she leaned back and exhaled, a small sign of concession. "We will review all submitted materials," she said carefully, "and we will respond after careful consideration." Her words were polite, but the edge of tension lingered. We left the office cautiously victorious. Outside, the sunlight felt warm on my face, a stark contrast to the icy tension we'd just endured. My neighbors and I exchanged smiles, a mix of relief, triumph, and exhaustion. We had survived the first real battle. The HOA had underestimated us, and for now, we had the upper hand. That evening, I returned to the farm, walking among the tall grass and listening to the clucking of my chickens and the soft bleating of my goats. The barn, once a quiet storage space, now felt like a command center, a place where courage and strategy had been forged. I realized that the fight wasn't over, but something had shifted. Confidence had replaced fear, and preparation had replaced uncertainty. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the fields, I knew this: the farm wasn't just a piece of land anymore. It was a symbol of resistance, of standing up to authority when it oversteps its bounds. And no matter what the HOA tried next, we had proven one thing: we weren't going to be bullied. After the showdown at the HOA office, I felt a cautious sense of triumph, but I also knew the battle wasn't fully over. The president's parting words echoed in my mind: "We will review your materials. Don't expect leniency if discrepancies remain." That statement hung over me like a storm cloud, a reminder that the fight could flare up again at any moment. I returned to the farm and dove back into research. I spent hours combing through local laws, property records, and HOA bylaws, cross-referencing every citation, every clause, and every supposed violation. I compiled a thorough packet of evidence, detailing each error, misstatement, and overreach. By the time I finished, my kitchen table was buried in papers. Maps, deeds, legal precedents, stacked high enough to rival a small library. I also reached out to a lawyer who specialized in property law and HOA disputes. They reviewed my documents, nodded thoughtfully, and said something that gave me a surge of confidence. "You're right. This HOA has no jurisdiction over your property. Their claims are legally invalid. If they pursue this, they're the ones who risk penalties." With that validation, I felt a renewed sense of determination. I drafted a formal cease and desist letter, carefully detailing each error in their claims and warning that any further attempts to enforce illegitimate fines would be met with legal action. I sent it via certified mail and email, keeping copies for my records. Then came the waiting, long, tense days where I checked the mailbox every hour, expecting retaliation or further threats. And then, finally, a letter arrived. This time, it wasn't aggressive. There were no fines, no threats, no ominous warnings. The HOA admitted their error, acknowledged that my property lay outside their jurisdiction, and confirmed that all fines were rescinded. The relief that washed over me was unlike anything I'd felt in weeks. My farm, my sanctuary, was safe. I could finally breathe. I celebrated in the only way that felt right, by nomming one of my pigs by law. My neighbors, who had fought alongside me, laughed until they cried. Humor, after all, had been a lifeline through the tension, a reminder that no matter how absurd or oppressive the situation, we could still find joy. Even though the letters from the HOA were over, the experience had left a mark. I realized how easily authority could overreach when unchecked, how vulnerable ordinary people could be when facing a well-organized organization, and how important it was to stand up for what was right. The farm had become more than a place to escape. It had become a symbol of persistence, courage, and self-reliance. That night I walked among the fields, the tall grass swaying gently in the wind, my chickens clucking as if celebrating the victory with me. I inspected the barn, the fences, and the garden I had planted with my own hands. Everything felt like it had earned its place through struggle and perseverance. The fight against the HOA had been exhausting, frustrating, and at times absurd, but it had also reminded me why I had chosen this life: freedom, independence, and the right to control my own property. As I watched the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, a final letter arrived in the mailbox. My heart skipped a beat. Could it be another threat? Another attempt at intimidation? I carefully opened it. Surprisingly, it was polite, almost cordial. No fines, no threats, just a formal acknowledgement of my victory and a note that the HOA would review its procedures to prevent future errors. I chuckled and framed the letter above my desk. It was a trophy, a reminder that standing firm and prepared could turn the tide even against daunting opposition. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. The farm, with its creaky barn, wandering goats, and clucking chickens, felt truly mine. The struggle had been exhausting, but it had also been empowering. I had faced intimidation, threats, and bureaucracy, and I had won. I realized something important. The fight wasn't just about the farm, or the money, or the fines. It was about autonomy, dignity, and the courage to stand up when something is unjust. And that lesson, more than any vegetable patch or chicken coop, was what made the farm feel like home. The farm finally felt like mine again. The air smelled like fresh earth, grass, and freedom. The creaking of the barn, the clucking of the chickens, and even the occasional bleat from the goats had never sounded so sweet. After weeks of letters, calls, confrontations, and late-night research, the HOA had conceded. My property, my dream, my sanctuary was safe. For the first time in weeks, I could focus on the simple joys of farm life without the looming shadow of bureaucracy. I walked along the fence line, inspecting repairs I had made, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. The chickens pecked happily at the dirt, and I swear the goats were smirking at me, as if sharing in my small, hard-earned victory. Humor had carried me through the struggle, like nomming the pig, now it felt even. I reflected on everything that had happened. The letters, the threats, the tense meetings, the emergency summons, it had all felt overwhelming at the time, but each moment had strengthened my resolve. I had learned to navigate bureaucracy, to gather evidence, and to stand firm when faced with intimidation. I realized that my farm wasn't just land. It was a symbol of independence, a testament to perseverance, and proof that knowledge and preparation could win battles that initially seemed impossible. Neighbors who had joined the fight stopped by that morning, waving and smiling. One brought fresh eggs, another a loaf of homemade bread. We laughed together about the absurdity of the ordeal, the goat ringtone in the HOA office, the ridiculous letters, the emergency meetings. These shared experiences had forged bonds stronger than I had expected. The fight had started as an individual battle, but it ended as a small community united. Even the HOA had unintentionally provided a small gift, their final letter. Polite, formal, almost apologetic, it now hung framed in my kitchen. Every time I glanced at it, I smiled. It was a reminder that standing up for yourself, calmly, persistently, and intelligently, could not only protect your home but also your peace of mind. And in a way, the letter had become a trophy, a symbol of victory over fear, over intimidation, over those who underestimated you. As the day wore on, I tended to the I had neglected while dealing with the HOA battle. I mended fences, planted vegetables, and even took a moment to teach a neighbor's child how to gather eggs without scaring the chickens. Every task felt lighter now, every movement freer. I could focus entirely on the life I had chosen, a life defined not by rules imposed from elsewhere, but by the rhythm of nature, animals, and honest hard work. At sunset, I stood on the porch, a cup of tea in hand, and watched the farm bathed in golden light. The hills rolled gently into the horizon, the trees swayed in the evening breeze, and the barn doors creaked in harmony with the natural sounds of the farm. It struck me that this was what I had been fighting for, not just the land, but the right to experience life fully, without interference or fear. And somewhere in a quiet corner of the yard, the goat nudged my leg, the chickens gathered around, and the pig bylaw grunted approvingly. I laughed, realizing that humor, persistence, and courage had won the day. I took a deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs, and allowed myself a rare, unguarded smile. The farm was peaceful. The HOA had lost. I had won not through aggression, but through preparation, knowledge, and the unwavering belief that I had the right to my own land. In the end, I learned that freedom isn't something you buy, it's something you protect. And standing on that porch, watching the sun disappear behind the hills, I knew I had done just that. Outside the reach of the HOA, I had reclaimed not just my farm, but my peace of mind, my joy, and my life. The farm was mine, the dream was real. And nothing, no letter, no threat, no overreaching association, could take that away from me. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.